Welcome to the Dr. Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Continue your learning after the show at www.drjournalclub.com.
Please bear in mind that this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Talk to your doctor before making any medical decisions, changes, etc. Everything we're talking about, that's to teach you guys stuff and have fun. We are not your doctors. Also, we would love to answer your specific questions. On drjournalclub.com, you can post questions and comments for specific videos, but go ahead and email us directly at josh@drjournalclub.com. That's josh@drjournalclub.com. Send us your listener questions and we will discuss it on our pod. We had a wonderful listener reach out to us on Facebook and recommend a paper to talk about today for like listener questions. And I think we'll post a link, but it's basically like the mythology. It's a paper geared towards like health profession education, and but it touched on a lot of interesting ideas. And so there are a few things I thought like we could spin off on. One was this idea of mythology in health education in medicine. That I thought that was interesting. And then also like that not everything what is answerable by evidence and not everything is.
Well, they had like 5 specific questions.
Let's
and they
go.
were
Maybe
like,
can you go through those for the listeners and then maybe we'll riff off of that or something?
yeah. So the questions were, is everything a problem? Are all practitioner needs about problem solving?
Mm-hmm.
Are practitioner problems resolvable with sufficient evidence?
Mm-hmm.
And do all scholarly publications target practitioner problems? And then the last one is, do studies that focus on solving a real practitioner problem make the most significant contributions to the literature?
Right. And it's all within the context of like knowledge translation, right? Or
hmm
transmission. Basically, like, okay, you identify these gaps between the research and clinician practice, and then you come up with a way of getting that information to the clinicians, right? So then it's like, okay, well, that underlies all these ideas that maybe myths, like maybe not everything's a problem that needs to be solved through evidence, yada yada yada. So so I mean, what was your main take? Well, like when you read that, like where did your mind go as an evidence-based clinician?
I mean, it's kind of been like what we've been talking about. In the paper, they kind of said the answer to all these questions is no, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I mean, I think that there is a point of like, is everything a problem? I think the answer to that is no. Like, I think some things don't necessarily need to be researched just because they don't have a high yield.
Right.
Um, are practitioner problems resolvable with sufficient evidence? I think, in part of that, they came up with this concept of, or they didn't come up with it, but they mentioned this concept of like bounded rationality. And we kind of talked about that in a previous
Whoa, that
episode.
was I must have missed that. What does that mean? That's an interesting phrase. Bounded rationality.
Yeah, so basically, it has to do with the idea that we talked about with Matt Brignall when we were talking about evidence nihilism. And if we have evidence to support something, but we don't have the infrastructure, resources, perhaps the intervention itself is excellent, but there are other mitigating factors that are out of our control that makes it very difficult to implement,
Uh-huh.
then we kind of have to work within this concept of bounded rationality. And the quote from the paper was, this involves decision making under uncertainty, decision making framed by risk or deviations of people's behaviors from ideals,
Mm-hmm.
any or all of which can unravel the assumed translation of evidence to practice.
Right.
So that kind of being like all those other things that, in the research setting, yeah, we've shown that something can be efficacious.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we can't implement them, then what's the point? One interesting example was yesterday in clinic, we were talking about, we had a group discussion with some of our practitioners, just talking about some some conference highlights, and one of it was implementing, or one of the topics we talked about was like implementing Tai Chi in older individuals,
Hmm.
which I thought was great. But the question I had is, okay, well, where do we send them to do that?
Hmm. Right.
And will insurance cover for it? If insurance isn't going to cover it, how much is it going to cost? Like, where do we even send them to do like a group based Tai Chi in our elderly folks who aren't perhaps, let's say, within a um, nursing facility where that is something that's perhaps even, is it even being implemented in that nursing facility on a routine basis to make it worthwhile? Because maybe the study showed, hey, daily Tai Chi of an hour or 3 times a week for however many minutes. If that can't be implemented on a broad based scale, then almost like what's the point?
And okay, so I like that idea because I'm thinking of an analogous situation in my space. So I remember reading this meta-analysis on gut-directed hypnotherapy for IBS, and I got really jazzed and excited about the evidence. And then I was like, well, shoot, like how do I apply this? I'm not going to learn how to do hypnotherapy.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, right. And so I was like, oh, like there's an app for that, right? But the studies aren't on an app. The studies are in like in person or group therapy. And I started, getting people to do an app, but I just had really bad results. And anyway, I eventually found like a clinic that does it, and I've had pretty decent results. But like the idea is, you read this exciting study as a clinician, and then you're like, well, great. How do I do that? How do I apply that? Is an app an equivalent? Is it a fair statement to say that's bounded rationality, and if that's what I've got, that's good? Maybe it's not analogous at all. Or if you send someone a YouTube video for Tai Chi, is that going to be the same thing, or is that unfair? And but then you have, yeah, anyway, I don't know how, like, we get excited about this research, but then it's like, how do you apply it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think they do raise some interesting points here of like, one that I thought was interesting was, do all scholarly publications target practitioner problems? And
Yeah.
then on the other side is, do studies that focus on solving a real practitioner problem make the most significant contributions to the literature? I thought both of those were kind of interesting, especially that last one. Um, and if we're going to talk about the former, I guess one example would be, and something I've been pretty vocal about, is like, why do we care about mechanism of action of really any intervention as a
Thank
clinician?
God. Yeah, I know. And that's where all the funding's going.
As a clinician, like I do not care,
Yeah.
and I think it's a waste of brain space as a
And
clinician.
money,
Yeah,
funding money. Come on.
I mean, I'm not saying it's not important research. It is important because we have to know, okay, like, can we develop medications, or do we even know how like a supplement or some sort of intervention is working
Yeah.
to then create, therapies moving forward. So like from the bench is important, but when you're working the bedside, I genuinely do not care. I just want to know, is this helping my patient?
Mhm.
Is it causing harms? If so, what are those harms? And
Yep.
then are we actually preventing or significantly reducing the risk of the outcome that we care about? So if it's just like I don't care that statins inhibit the production of HMG CoAs in the liver. I care
Mhm.
that it's actually preventing heart attacks and strokes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that makes sense. Like if you're a pharmaceutical company and you've got billions of dollars and you want to work out mechanism of action and build up a study, awesome. Good on you, right? But if you've got public funding money and you have interventions that are out in the wild, like spend the money on more clinical trials, even if they're not, multi-million dollar RCTs, like get some data out there. I would much rather see that, more pragmatic stuff. No, I agree. And the other thing is, I was thinking about that as well from a funding perspective because I'm writing a bunch of grants now, and I was like, how how am I asked myself, like, when I'm writing a research paper, like the first paragraph basically, like, of any research paper, you're basically saying why what you found is so important, or why the condition you're studying is like going to kill all of humanity, and why all the other research have been worthless, but you have the idea, right? So this is very standard, like, what's the problem, what's the gap, what's the solution approach, and I'm really sick of it. But it's like, am I really writing for needs, or am I coming up with this after the fact? And I think there's a good argument to say I'm coming up with it after the fact. But on the flip side, with NIH funding, and we're writing a DoD, a Department of Defense grant now, they get to actually pick what gets researched, right? Because it's where the money is. And then you get every Friday, you get this push email from NIH about all the new funding opportunities. And so, for example, we saw one on seizures, and we're interested in concussion, and so we jumped all over it, and we're writing a grant now for post-traumatic epilepsy, right? And so it's like the funders in that case picked the research topic and interest. And so you could argue that if it's the government funded resource and there's some thought put into what's getting researched as far as the needs of the community, that's a great way to drive research that's relevant, right? By basically writing a very specific grant. We're interested in post-traumatic epilepsy. Here's a pot of $20 million. It's due in June. Go. Give us your best proposals, right? So that's something. That's one way to approach it, is with money.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And it's, it's difficult too, because I'm not sure, who has more funding. Is it the industry that has more funding, or the government that has more funding? And then, can you, let's say you get funding for a project, the funding goes pretty quickly because research is expensive. And so it's like, okay, are you then able to kind of continue that research out from what you've started to kind of add more to the knowledge base that's out there? You can't just put everyone into a 10,000 person randomized controlled trial and go from there. Like, you have to take the baby steps that are there, so this way you're not wasting all that money and those resources for not answering the right question in the appropriate manner. And so that's another thing too, of like, when they ask the question, do studies that focus on solving a real problem make the most significant contributions to the literature? And I thought that kind of like threw me for a tailspin, just like asking that question of like, and you would think, well, yeah, it should, right? If you're answering those questions, I can provide better clinical care. And their argument, or not necessarily an argument, but their discussion was, perhaps not.
Well, and when they say contribution, are they, I'm assuming like citation scores, impact factors, stuff like that, or just contribution like to science or to medicine in general?
I'm not sure. I couldn't really
I don't know if they defined it. I don't
define
remember.
that. Yeah. I mean, their first sentence was, there are few, if any, papers that provide a complete and definitive solution to the problem they have targeted. Which,
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
fair.
which I think is fair, because you can only answer so much in a given research paper, right?
Yeah.
That your question has to be specific in order to answer it, in a quote unquote definitive manner, or at least as definitive as possible. And you see this a lot, right? Where, let's say a medication comes out, there's some studies on it. But sometimes you'll have follow-up studies that will be like, well, this medication wasn't studied in a population of individuals with diabetes, or it was only studied between the ages of 20 and 45. So we actually don't know if there's benefit in those who are younger or older than that. And so as a clinician, you can maybe make some extrapolations of like, hey, we don't have the data for this medication in older or younger individuals, but from the evidence that we do have, here's what we see. Whether or not it's safe, and just because of age, we can't say. We'll need the research to show that. And so I think that's where they're kind of getting at. And sometimes I do get frustrated when I see that, of like, okay, we have a medication, let's talk about like the GLP-1 agonists. They're marvelous,
which I'm obsessed with, by the way.
Yeah,
go ahead.
They're marvelous with weight loss, but then you have these studies. Initially, it's like, oh well, these have only been studied in individuals with diabetes. We don't know what their how effective they are in individuals without diabetes. Right. And then it's like, oh, we had it in a population of individuals with diabetes without renal dysfunction. So now we have to study like that. So you kind of like you can constantly like make it more specific and specific and specific.
The
which
idea
is
of
like
a definitive study is absurd.
Yeah.
It's
And it's like,
iterative.
okay, how many definitive studies do you need before you just say, okay, like, I think that these results are enough to make that generalization?
Well, me, my answer is grade. When the grade level gets to high, you can stop writing research grants, right? Like, it's just future research is by definition with that not likely to change the outcome, not likely to change the effect size. But yeah, the idea that there be a single study. So to your point, which is excellent, which is applying it to nuanced subgroups and real life. And then there's the implementation piece. And then there's also just like evidence is not definitive. Evidence is organic and it takes time to develop. And there's lag time bias and cumulative meta analyses. And I've just seen that time and time again. And so, again, I think you do the best with what you have now and you're open to change. But this idea that there would be a definitive study, that does not make sense to me at all.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's funny, or not funny, but interesting too, of like how many more vitamin D trials do we need? Right?
Yeah,
It's
you're on
like,
a D kick lately.
yeah.
Or a kick
Yeah.
lately.
Well, I mean, it's just like we have so many studies, and just each study is just showing like a null effect, and it's just like, okay, at this point, the grade has to be like low to very low, and it's just like, what's the next question that we're going to ask? What's like, okay,
or grade
vitamin D-
level high that there's no effect.
Yeah.
You mean, yeah.
Sorry. And it's just like, okay, well, we've studied individuals with a baseline vitamin D of 35, but what if it's 40? Or what if it's, what if it's 10? It's just like,
yeah.
Oh my God. It's like every little thing that we're picking apart and we keep getting to the same conclusion. It's like, okay, can we now, can we fund something else, please? And
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. When do we say, well, I think, so, that concept in logic. So, I have this, I got to show you, I got this poster. It's got big letters over here. Thou shalt not commit logical fallacies right over my desk. And it's like, just goes through like all the cognitive biases and logical fallacies. Anyway, so there's this logical fallacy. I don't know if it's logical fallacy, but there's this concept that you can't prove a negative, right? Like there's always going to be some other variant of the question that, well, maybe this. Well, maybe if it was, baseline levels of 40. Well, maybe if you use this homeopathic med, or whatever it is. And so pragmatically, you have to make a decision when to stop, but you're never going to be able to prove a negative. What I do say, and Matt Brignall, I give him credit for this. He turned me on to this, which is this idea, sort of the Bayesian concept of like if as the probability of something gets lower, right? So if we have these cumulative studies saying there's no effect, your priors are just so low, right, that it would work, that you're just going to need so much more convincing evidence to be convinced if you see something later. And that kind of makes sense to me, right? So it's like, okay, well, we have 20 studies with a null effect. Maybe if the baseline was between 42 and 47, we would see something. And and by the way, there's a randomized controlled trial that says that. But our suspicion, I mean, our need for evidence would just need to be so much higher at that point because the priors are so low. Does that make sense? I think I like to think of it that way these days.
Yeah. But and even like going back to like, do studies that focus on solving a real problem make the most significant contributions? You can have two like very important randomized controlled trials that are trying to answer the same question that are very similar but come to different conclusions. And then that's when you see a lot of discussion and like nitpicking of those studies. And we still kind of go around in circles, like not really knowing what to do, but we kind of try to come up with the best answer. And I think, a lot of those trials looking at like, they're still looking like, is there a specific target for blood pressure, right? We have the SPRINT trial, which showed like, let's get as low as possible. Let's get less than 120/80 by any means possible. And that's good. But then we have other trials showing that, hey, as long as we get less than 140/90, you're probably okay. In going even more strict with blood pressure targets, the amount of benefits only going to be slightly incremental of like maybe an additional 1% reduction in that risk. Is that worth it?
All the extra people passing out,
right,
stuff
like that, and then so then you have all these different offshoots, and I don't know if we've still come to an answer yet as to like what is the target blood pressure. And I'm sure someone out there probably knows or knows the literature much better, and that's great. But I'm just using that as an example of like, hey, it took if we do have an answer now, it's taken a long time to get there. Yeah,
decades and hundreds of millions of dollars. Like these, blood pressure meds, heart attack. I mean, these are massive trials that run for so long and cost so much money. And again, I'm okay with that. Like we live in an imperfect world, imprecise world, and we need to make clinical decisions based on what we have, and that may change. Um, no, I that makes sense to me. And again, and I'm comfortable also changing our thoughts later. I was thinking too about this idea of I wanted to run two other ideas by you. So
Mhm.
in that paper, they talked about right, so having research questions that are relevant to clinicians, right? So the question is like, how do you decide what's relevant? And one we talked about is funding. The other, like whoever's deciding the topic based on funding. The other is, and this I'm seeing this more and more. Like for example, in the DoD grant, there's an explicit page saying, well, you don't have to, but it'd be really good if you did community involvement in the design. And when you submit to BMJ, for example, there's a required section that has to go in your manuscript about, did you involve the community? And if you didn't, you have to say that in your manuscript and defend it.
Now we ignored patient needs.
Yeah, I know. Literally, like you have to find a way to say that isn't terrible, and so then you're shamed into doing it, which is great because it makes so much sense. We've just been lazy until now, right? So I really want to start doing community involvement, but I think the idea is that if you actually talk to people that have this condition, or you talk to clinicians, you get a much better lived experience of what the needs are. And I think meta analysts like myself, we have a hubris that like, oh yeah, we're methodology experts and we could just go in for any topic that maybe we know nothing about and pop out a really high quality meta-analysis, which is of course absurd, right? You need those content experts and you need the community. So one idea I think I wanted to get your thoughts on is this community involvement in the research to get clinically relevant questions. And then the other is more hybrid, like I'm trying to play with the gastro AMP, that naturopathic group for gastroenterology, having them fund research, finding research that's relevant to them. Like we've been doing that with SIBO. It's like it's like pocket change funding, but it's something too to kind of work with professional groups to figure out what their needs are research wise and try to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a couple things there. One is I would love to see more like multimodal funding, or more funding for multimodal based type of research, because like we have a lot of like intervention A compared to intervention B, but something within like the integrative community is like, well, I'm not only using one intervention, I'm doing like 9 different things at once.
Right.
And so from a research standpoint, you're like, well, then we don't know what's working. And then from the other standpoint is like, I don't care.
Who
Like,
cares?
the outcome, right? If the
Yeah.
patient is getting better, why do I care which
Yeah.
one specifically is working? And maybe it's one of those things where, what is it? The sum of all parts is bigger than whatever.
Yeah. Systems theory. Yeah.
Yeah. And I totally understand why it's important to know which one is working, because then if you're going to be getting funding for certain things, you need to know, okay, which ones are providing the most benefit, so we're not wasting those resources. Because if there is one thing there that's actually not doing anything, we should just throw it out. But at the same time, is that more of like a moot point, or is that actually something that really should be pieced out?
Well, I remember there's a very famous critic of the naturopathic profession who's very active on Twitter, at least she used to be. And I remember early in my career when I had more of a chip on my shoulder, I would engage in things like this. And so one of the criticisms that was lobbed was, because we have naturopathic medicine has a few whole systems, multimodal randomized controlled trials. And the question was, and they showed benefit. And the question raised was, well, there wasn't a true placebo group, right? It was against standard of care. Basically standard of care plus naturopathic medicine compared to standard of care. And that's a very common way of doing pragmatic research. But these questions were raised. And so with our stated goals of steel manning or steel womaning or steel personing an argument, despite the person lobbying it, I take that the criticism very seriously, and so I thought a lot about that, and I think that there are benefits to doing it the way that it was designed, which we've talked about. It's pragmatic, it's real life. You either send someone to their primary care, or you send them to their primary care and tell them to go see a naturopath, right? So that's real life results. But yeah, like it could be that they're getting better from placebo. And so you say, well, why does that matter? And cost is one, right? It's expensive to go see all these providers and to pay for all these things. The other is kind of safety too. Like that's the other big thing I could come up with is like, okay, well, if you're recommending 5 things and none of them work and it's just placebo effect and one of them's dangerous, you're taking an
Yeah.
unnecessary risk. Or one of them works and one of them is dangerous and you can get away with just the one that works and avoid the side effects from the one that's dangerous. So like I think there are arguments, clinical relevance arguments, not just mechanism of action arguments. But I agree. I think pragmatically, it's just wonderful to know, hey, my choice is, do I send them to a naturopath as well as a referral, or chiropractic does a lot of research like this too,
Hmm.
or not? And that is useful information.
Yeah, and I think on that topic too, and something that I've thought about is if we already have a standard of care in place, why are we doing more, placebo-based research when we should just be carrying or comparing it to the standard of care? Because we're not going to be selecting the placebo as a treatment. We're going to be selecting the standard of care as a treatment.
Right.
So that
Yes,
ought to kind of be what you're comparing to. And if you're
that's
getting
right.
additional benefit to standard of care, well, now your standard of care is going to change to include that one thing that showed even more benefit.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Or at least have a time and attention control, basically. Because the other thing, yeah, I think time and attention control. So if you sent them for 5 hours a week to go see a chiropractor, at least have the other group do 5 hours a week, with something like reading a health, it's usually like reading like a health
Hmm.
document about back pain or something like that. But at least you're controlling for some of those effects. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's like, you're not going to give someone a placebo and you're not going to tell them to go sit in a corner and read a pamphlet either, right? For 5 hours. So,
Good.
you know, there's that issue. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, any other, led to some good discussion points. Any other, riffs you want to do based on the paper that was that we read?
I had one thought. Is shared decision making really everything that it's been made out to be? Or should it, like, I've seen both camps where some people like only do shared decision making and then some people advocate for actually, no, it really should just be the clinician for the most part making the decisions, like showing all the options, but then really giving the input as to what medically would be more is more indicated. Because often, and you
Yeah.
run into it sometimes, right? Of patients being like, "Well, what would you do? What would you
Right.
recommend?" Type of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
And so, going back to that research of like community involvement is kind of like, well, how much of that is actually going to be important or influential to the study question at hand?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I think we should do like a whole series on
Mhm.
shared decision making. Read some of Montori's papers because one of the things that he's done for that, and this I think answers your question, like the way he approaches this, is he does a lot of work around decision aids, and so these very visually appealing documents with like great icons and things like that basically show like they survey patients like what matters to you, and they're like, well, cost matters, insurance coverage, the number of pills, how frequently I have to take them, things like that. And then they lay out in very visually appealing ways all of those topics, which drugs are better for what, how many pills with this one, how many pills for that one, what's the cost, etc. And it's all and that's all based upon high level evidence, but it's presented based on the desires or the questions, decision making points of patients. And then the thought is you bring out this card with your patient in front of you and you have that conversation, and the conversation is sort of jump started by that sort of aid.
Yeah.
So you could survey the community to come up with those areas, number of pills, costs, things like that, and then use the research to inform that. And then you have that discussion around, like they could say, well, I don't really care about, I take 20 supplements anyway, I don't care if I take another 6 or something like that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, I just always thought that was kind of a fascinating thing of, you know, a lot of people are so gung ho about shared decision making, and I'm certainly kind of, I do it all the time, but I also understand the point of like, well, if you're the one who has the knowledge of like what is more medically
Hmm.
indicated, sometimes having that shared decision making can backfire. Of like, if you show all the options and they're like, no, I don't want to do any of it, and you're like, well, well, hold on, like, let's reconsider that because of, maybe you have some sort of condition that is like, if we let it progress, can be very detrimental.
Hmm.
And so we ought to start something. But
Yeah.
if that person's gonna say, no, I don't want anything, and you're like, okay, well,
Yeah. How do you make, I,
yeah.
so that's a good question again. Like, how do you do shared decision making well? And so
Mhm.
so part of me wonders, like, am I just doing it poorly when I have these concerns? or is it just limited? And at a certain point, you just have to be like, your risk of having a heart attack is like 50% in the next year, and we need to get you on something.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, at the end of the day, if they're like, yeah, no thanks, that doesn't fit within my value system, I mean, what are you supposed to do?
Right.
But yeah, let's take this as a motivator to read a bunch of Victor Montori's work and start discussing it. I bet he's got some systematic review of all of his work or whatever be a good starting point, because I don't know much about it. I mean, he was on a grant that we submitted a couple of years ago, so I know him a little bit, and I've worked with him a little bit, and I've read some of his work because of that, just in prep for the grant. But I don't know his work very well, just to be fascinated enough by it. So maybe we have like a Victor Montori month, just read through these papers, and I think it would be very clinically relevant.
Yeah, Victor, I know you're listening, so send us some
There
papers.
You go. That's right. This is our official plea to get you on the books. We'll do our homework, but we want to see you here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Helene Marcella, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, for sending us this paper by Thomas and Ellaway, 2023. I thought it led to some fascinating discussion. We'll put a link to the paper up there. And again, dear listener, if you have any questions, we've got a paper that you think is interesting, just like Helene did, send it our way. We'll have a chat about it. If you have any specific questions, send that our way. We'll have a chat about that as well.
And where can they find us?
You can find in all your favorite podcasts. Podcast is the word. Consummate professionals here, listeners. Just so you know, I am taking a podcasting class, and I am ratcheting up my professionalism. You can't see this right now, but I have a new microphone that I'm very excited about. And I even have special headphones so I can hear the sound properly. All that is worthless if I can't remember the name of the domain that we're working in. Podcasting. So you can find our podcast at all your favorite podcast distributors like Apple Podcasts, BuzzFeed, et cetera, or Buzzsprout. Oh man, I am just screwing this up. Okay, let's do another take. Adam, where can they find us?
For podcasts, you can find us anywhere that there's most podcast mediums. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I don't know. Where else do people listen to podcasts?
I've got us on. Hold on. I'll tell you all. I've got us everywhere. So Buzzsprout is where we are hosted. But what I've learned is we're just set up through the different, they're called directories. Okay. So we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podcast Index, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn and Alexa. That's kind of cool. Oh, I just said the A word. I wonder if she didn't turn on. That's good.
Alexa, turn on Dr. Journal Club.
Turn on Dr. Journal Club. I haven't tried that yet. So, dear listener, if any of you are listening, test that out. See if the Alexa feature works for the Dr. Journal Club podcast. All right. What else? What other things do we have to say? Oh, don't make medical decisions based on what we talk about. We're just chatting and having fun and teaching you stuff. What other things should we talk about?
Where can they find us on social?
Where can you... Okay. All right. We also have social media. We've got Twitter. We've got Facebook. Adam's in charge of Instagram because I don't know how in the world that thing works. I'm telling you, I've tried to go on. I set up my own account. It just is worthless. You can't put links on there. I think basically all you can do is post pictures. I sound like such an old man, but I'm telling you, I just do not understand that platform at all. But I got back into Twitter thanks to this podcast, and I've discovered MedLib Twitter, which is medical librarians, which is like amazing if you're into evidence synthesis. There's like Epi Twitter. I'm having a lot of fun from like a methods nerd perspective. But we are now on Twitter as well. Any other places that we're at?
We're not on TikTok yet.
We're not on TikTok yet. It's pending until the U.S. government decides what they want to do about it. I think that's all we've got for you today.
Nice.
Podcast, Josh. That's the word.
Did the caffeine just hit?
Oh, no, man. I need to go to bed.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, my God.
Dear listener, thank you for bearing with us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Be sure to visit www.drjournalclub.com to learn more.